Right, hello everyone, ValueHeavy Peter here with a quick video on how to adapt when your opponents play differently than the solver. Now, obviously there's a lot of things to say with a question like that, but this interesting question came up on my Discord and I thought it was fun to maybe show you guys what we talked about. It's basically one of the guys on Discord asked a question, okay, let's say if my opponent has like a few value combos more or a few better hands than he's supposed to have in his range, how does that adapt our strategy? And it was a very interesting spot, so I thought I would just show it to everyone. We have a 3-bet pot, right? The flop is 9-7-3. We're holding pocket 8s in the small blind, right? And on the flop, we're like 9-7-3, we can do some checking, we can do some betting. You see solver checks like 67% here. And then if you only have one sizing, it's a bigger sizing. And yeah, pocket 8s doesn't really fit in a big size on the flop. So we decide to check. You see, we also check a lot of our stronger hands. We can still bet 8, especially if we have like a club in this situation. Not super relevant, but yeah, it comes down to, okay, 8 is like cutoff point where it's maybe just fine to bet big, but we don't necessarily have to. And then you see 6s is like pure check in this situation. So yeah, our hero in the story went for a check. When we look at strategy, once we check, in position is supposed to bet quite a bit, 61%. But in this situation, he checked behind. We have a deuce of spades on the turn, and then it's a bit, okay, what's our strategy? Right? And when you look at strategy with like pocket 8s, okay, again, we can choose a bit what to do, we can bet, we can check, and out of position, especially the solver wants to have some mediocre and some stronger hands. You see that aces checks pure here in this spot, but let's just try to focus purely, okay, pocket 8, we can bet, we can check. Now, what happens when we bet pot with pocket 8? Because we're starting to go very polar here. Right? This is not like, oh, let's go for a small sizing and squeeze out some value with 8. No, the solver is like, hey, I want to polarize. In this situation, I still have kings, queens, jacks, 10s, where I want to go for huge sizings. Obviously, pocket 9s, I want to get the money in by the river, right? So let's bet huge in this situation. So we bet 100% pot. Our opponent calls. So yeah, let's say river is a 9 of clubs here, and solver like, yeah, we can jam 8 for value here, right? Not always, but there are some of these rivers where like, yeah, maybe like 3 of clubs, probably we jam quite a bit. Depends a bit on the suit. The person in Discord basically said, okay, we're allowed to jam 8 here, which seems a bit thin on this board, right? And his question came down to, okay, like, are we still allowed to do this if our opponent has jacks and 10s? Because if I look at our opponent's range, he should be capped towards, like, he has some sets, but then he's capped towards 8, 7, 6s, 5s, 4s. Like, he has a lot of these lower pocket pairs. So yeah, and then you see when we do jam, when we look at the hands that's supposed to call, like with 8 we jam because we get called by some 8, 7s, some pocket 7s. There's 8s in this range too. Our opponents are supposed to call 6s, 5s, 4s, right? And it makes sense because on this run out, he also doesn't have many hands to defend with. He needs to call enough hands here, right? He needs to have some aces. He needs to have some 9x he checked, and a lot of people don't check a 9 on the flop, right? He needs to slow play some sets on the flop, right? So when you're jamming 8 here, you're doing this for value. Obviously, you're trying to get called by worse pairs, and that's gonna happen often enough, so the solver says, hey, this is fine. Now, the guy on Discord asked, well, yeah, let's say our opponent has jacks 10s here on the river, which he's not supposed to have, right? His calling range pre-flop is mainly like from these lower portion of the region, and then some suited broadways. All these hands, yeah, don't really beat pocket 8s, but let's say he has jacks or 10s that he calls in the button versus small blind, and you'll see enough of your opponents on Microstakes do this. How does it change the strategy? Do we now not jam the river? He was a little bit confused about this, right? So what I did is I made a new solve. Like, I just copy pasted the same exact solve, but now what we're doing is we're just gonna add jacks and 10s pure. That's it. Nothing else in the range. Now, obviously, you could argue if he calls jacks 10s, he probably plays some different hands differently too. But just for the sake of the argument, let's say we think or we know exactly our opponent has jacks and tens that he calls pre-flop. How does that change things, right? And you already see huge difference on flop. Just the jacks and the tens in there, which obviously is 12 combinations. That's enough to tell us, hey, we're not betting anymore. We don't care that we have aces, kings, queens. He doesn't. At this point, him having jacks or tens is already enough for us to be way more careful. And we can look at the ranges here to have a look at it. And we see that it's like basically very similar. So this is the original one. Sorry, we need to go to the flop. Obviously, in the original one, we generally are doing about the same. And then we have a big nut advantage here with our overpairs at the top of our range. Well, in the new solution, not too much changes. It's just that this part shifts a bit. Like he has a little bit better hands here, which is mainly those jack stands at the top, right? And this shifts the equity towards 53% for the button, where originally it was 50%. So it's a 3% equity difference, right? The EV goes up quite a bit from the button, and it already tilts enough where we're checking range, which is insane, right? That we have such a big difference. Now you could say, oh, but solver here chooses small sizing. Well, if I would put in a bigger sizing, the same is gonna happen, right? That's not really gonna change anything about our strategy, right? So yeah, like now we have like slivers of bets, but again, this is, you can kind of ignore this. Now, yeah, how does things change then when we check? We can again look at the original sim. After we check, he's supposed to bet like 62%. Things are quite similar. He bets a little bit more. Obviously, he now has those jacks, tens that want to bet. But it's also important, he's going to check that a little bit, right? And that's what our hero of the story, the original poster on Discord, basically was saying like, yeah, what if he sometimes has jacks, tens here? So I'm not even going to change this. Like, maybe you could be worried that people check more because they're scared of getting check raised here with jack stands. I would expect the population to mainly bet, but sure, sometimes they can check. And the solver also sometimes checks these hands. So besides that, it's going to be a bit similar. Now, previously, we saw that we potted the turn after check, and we see that we do the same sizing, right? Again, pot on the turn, pot. Here we bet 23%. Here we actually bet more at this point in the second sim, 26%. So we're actually allowed to bet more. Now, what changes? A huge difference is here, the original sim, we bet more than half the time with 8s. Now, pure check. Huge mistake to bet here with 8s. And it all makes a bit of sense, right? Like in the original sim, we're checking a bit more with our overpairs ourselves. Now on the turn with our overpairs, we're like, oh, we can get value from jack stands. Let's pot it. Let's play for stacks by the river, right? But the 8 here is now like, well, if I pot and then I jam, I kind of value own myself, right? And you can kind of see that, let's say we would pot, now 8 is not here in this range, and let's find the same river as previously. Obviously 8 is not in here anymore because we're supposed to pure check, but let's say we jam. Let's have a look, like he has those jack stands he can call with. He now needs to call less of these 6s, 5s, 4s in his range, right? He can start folding some 7x here. Right, so with 8, we just don't get enough value and we just own ourselves way too much with jacks and tens. So I think this is a good example to show you, hey, you're learning probably a lot of good theories with the solver, but keep an open mind and know that solver solutions are very fragile. And just changing the inputs a little bit, I would argue jacks and tens is maybe already quite a big difference. But just changing things up a little bit can already change our strategy completely. So keep that in mind in game. Don't try to fully rely on, oh, I'm gonna follow a solver strategy. Keep an open mind. How do we think his range looks like? How do we want to play against that range? What makes sense versus his range? But because the moment your opponent plays a different range than a solver would, you need to start adapting your own strategy yourself if you want to get the max EV, right? So yeah, I think this was a very interesting concept. I think this was a cool video for a quick video. So yeah, that's about it. Have a good one and talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.